J'ouvre maintenant la séance.
The session is now open. Welcome to meeting number 98 of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts.
Format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and possibly even on the Zoom application. Conformément à l'article.
Pursuant to Article 108.3g of the Standing Orders, our committee is meeting today in the context of the Report Number 1, ArriveCAN 2024, from our Auditor General.
From the Office of the Auditor General, Karen Hogan, Auditor General, nice to see you again. Andrew Hayes, nice to see you as well, who is the Deputy Auditor General, and Sami Hanush, Principal. Nice to see you as well. I just will pause for a second. Mr. Desjardins, are you comfortable sitting where you're at, or would you like everyone to move a little bit to the right? I don't mind taking a minute now because
sure.
you have several speaking orders.
Let's do it.
Could I just get everyone to kind of move? It's just a little easier. You're well, or you're welcome to go to the far left and. Very good. Thank you. Ms. Hogan will begin with the statement, and once folks are settled, I'm just going to wait 10 seconds here. Very good. Ms. Hogan, you have the floor now for your opening comments, and we'll turn to questions from the members. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I am pleased to be here today to discuss our audit report of the ArriveCAN application, which was tabled in the House of Commons. I wish to acknowledge that the lands on which we are gathered are part of the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Our audit of the ArriveCAN application looked at how the Canada Border Services Agency, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and Public Services and Procurement Canada manage the procurement and development of the application, and whether they spent public funds in a way that delivered value for money. I will discuss our findings, but first, I have to say that I am deeply concerned by what this audit didn't find. We didn't find records to accurately show how much was spent on what, who did the work, or how and why contracting decisions were made. And that paper trail should have existed. Overall, this audit shows a glaring disregard for basic management and contracting practices throughout ArriveCAN's development and implementation. Si les organisations gouvernementales
Government organizations needed to be flexible and fast in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, but they still needed to document their decisions and demonstrate the prudent use of public funds. In this audit, we found disappointing failures and omissions everywhere we looked. Most concerning was that the Canada Border Services Agency did not have complete and accurate financial records. Because of this, we were unable to calculate the exact cost of the ArriveCAN application. By piecing together information available, we estimated that ArriveCAN cost approximately $59.5 million. There was confusion right from the beginning. From April 2020 to July 2021, we found that the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Canada Border Services Agency did not work together to establish each agency's responsibilities for ArriveCAN. In this accountability void, neither organization developed and implemented good project management practices, such as developing objectives and goals, and budgets and cost estimates. In our examination of contracting practices, we saw little documentation to support how and why the Canada Border Services Agency initially awarded GC Strategies the ArriveCAN contract through a non-competitive process. Only one potential contractor submitted a proposal, and that proposal did not come from GC Strategies.
We found evidence that GC Strategies was involved in the development of requirements that were used when the agency later moved to a competitive process to award a $25 million contract for work on the ArriveCAN app. The requirements were very specific and narrow. This gave GC Strategies an advantage that other potential bidders did not have. We also found that the Canada Border Services Agency's overall management of contracts was very poor. Essential information was missing from awarded contracts, such as clear deliverables and the qualifications required of workers. When we looked at invoices approved by the agency, details about the work performed and who did the work were often missing. This greatly contributed to our conclusion that the best value for money was not achieved.
Finally, we found no evidence that Canada Border Services Agency employees disclosed invitations to private functions that they received from contractors, as is required by the agency's Code of Values and Ethics. This created a significant risk or perception of a conflict of interest or bias around procurement decisions. Public servants must always be transparent and accountable to Canadians for their use of public funds. An emergency does not mean that all the rules go out the window and that departments and agencies are no longer required to document their decisions and keep complete and accurate records. As I said earlier, I believe that this audit of ArriveCAN shows a glaring disregard for basic management practices. As a result, many questions that parliamentarians and Canadians are asking cannot be answered. The lack of information to support ArriveCAN spending and decisions has compromised accountability. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening statement. We would be very pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you. And thank you to you once again.
Round of question. Each member will have 6 minutes, beginning with the official opposition. Mr. Barrett, you have the floor for 6. I understand you wish to split your time. Over to you.
Auditor, thank you very much for being here today. Did Canadian taxpayers get value for money from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government on the $60 million ArriveCAN app?
So we concluded that the public service did not ensure that Canada received best value for money. I would tell you that we paid too much for this application.
You described it as the Trudeau government having, quote, glaring disregard for management practices, end quote, and poor record keeping, a lack of basic due diligence, and that you were, quote, unable to determine the precise cost of the ArriveCAN app, end quote. So $60 million is an estimate. Is that correct?
Yes, we estimated that it cost around $59.5 million. There could be amounts there that should not be linked to ArriveCAN, but there also could be amounts that are linked to ArriveCAN that were not flagged in the books and linked to that project.
So it's reasonable to say that it could be more than $60 million.
It's reasonable to say that we've put together the best estimate, but it took a lot of effort. We had to go through many journal entries all the way back down to task authorizations to see whether or not items were linked to ArriveCan, professional judgment
Right.
was needed. Yes.
Right, and just to quote the key facts from your report, it says, quote, "This made it impossible to accurately attribute costs to projects," end quote, with respect to the poor record keeping. You've been investigating billions of dollars in government spending over your tenure as Auditor General. Would you say that the Trudeau government's ArriveCan is the worst that you've seen?
So I looked at a lot of contracting that happened during the pandemic when the public service was acts quickly and serve the public. This would probably be the first example that I've seen where there is such a glaring disregard for some of the most basic and fundamental policies and rules and controls.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Mr. Berchtold, please.
Mr. Berthold, vous avez 30 minutes.
3 minutes, 3 seconds, Mr. Berthold. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Hogan, for your report. I want to say first that I'm shocked and scandalized by the way the government of Prime Minister Trudeau has acted. And I quote your press community. You talk about glaring disregard for management practices with regard to the management of ArriveCan. Now, there was a motion moved by the Conservatives, and we would not be here today and to actually examine the practices of government. And the Liberal members of Parliament voted against the inquiry. And here today we're seeing troubling outcomes. Now, Canadians, did they get value for money with ArriveCan? Our understanding is that the value received is not in keeping with funds spent. The government paid too much for the application, and there are a number of reasons to support this observation. The ongoing dependence on external contractors, the lack of justification as to why they chose a given contractor, and why always call upon resources with 10 years of experience or more. Now, the documentation did not show why it was the right decision, and even with, the lack of competition in the processes, we believe that Canadians did not get value for money. Ms. Hogan, you said that concerning the application, you cannot calculate the exact cost because of record keeping. Is it possible that the ArriveCan cost even more than what you've determined? It's possible that it might have cost less because the bookkeeping I looked at is the worst I've seen in years. The lack of information to support the work done, if it is actually tied in with ArriveCan, I've been left perplexed. And I cannot give you a more exact figure. And I don't know why it's come to that. The record keeping should have existed, and public service in the past has done a lot better. Ms. Hogan, in all of your experience with all of the files you've worked on with your team, would you have ever imagined having found in Canada's public service under this government as bad an example of this glaring lack of accountability? It is surprising to see the extent to which the most basic elementary policies were not followed when it came to managing ArriveCan. Might you ever have thought that you'd not be able to identify who had awarded a contract of more than $19 million to an external firm? Well, the decision who took the decision, or the evidence to show who took that decision, is lacking. But we have found a description of the work, the requirements to award the contract, and that comes from a ministerial directive. When a public servant exercises their delegated authorities by signing the request, it's accompanied by responsibilities. And I would have expected that if the public servant was uncomfortable, did not want to sign the document, they would have asked their superior or put in the file the reasons for this. But the record keeping is very slim, and important and elementary decisions were not well documented for the procurement file. Thank you, Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Souza, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you again for your presentation, your work, and your contribution in trying to determine how best to proceed as we go forward. Notwithstanding the deficiencies that you've encountered, we're more concerned about the pervasive nature of what can take place. And certainly CBSA and the internal review that's being done, they've agreed with your recommendations. I believe they've had ongoing discussions with you to try to find appropriate measures to go forward. But a couple of questions as it relates to this particular instance and point in time. Did resources exist in government to churn around the ArriveCAN applications at the time under the time constraints that were evident?
So we found that the departments or the agencies had made an assessment that they did not have the skills or the capacity to deliver the ArriveCAN app when we're going back to the early parts of the pandemic. And in my view, that's a reasonable decision to use an external party to help move that forward, given all that was going on at that time. I would have, however, expected to see less of a long-term dependency on external resources as time went on. And we didn't see that transition, whether it be that the public service take over some of the operations of the application or that there be a transfer of some knowledge or skills so that the public service could be in a place down the line to take care of the application, but then also to demonstrate that the agencies approach this with due regard for value for money. And that transition just didn't happen.
I appreciate that. And one of the reasons our committees have been engaged in this file and the CBSA has been doing an internal investigation is to ensure, and one of the reasons it was submitted to the RCMP initially was because of some of the concerns that were shared as well. Have you had a discussion with Ms. O'Gorman or Michelle Lafleur, who's in charge of the investigation and the integrity component of this?
So throughout the audit, I did have a few conversations with the president of Canada Border Services Agency, as well as my Deputy Auditor General. I have not talked with the investigator. The team has seen the preliminary facts, but I didn't want to compromise my impartiality by looking at something that was not yet complete. So I haven't had more fulsome conversations.
And we're concerned about that integrity and that impartiality. We're trying not to obscure or obstruct the nature of his investigation because he's going into something even more specific about the conduct of individuals as well. And this is the issue that we're concerned about. We want to make sure that people didn't do work and somehow got paid all this extra money for work not being done. Did that come across in your investigations?
So many times when we looked at invoices, some of the most basic support was missing, whether it be an indication on the invoice as to what IT project the work related to. There were several IT projects underway at the Canada Border Service Agency at the time. And when you don't have that information, it's hard to know when we're looking at it after the fact. What project it related to. And it's also hard for individuals who are trying to maintain accurate financial records to know where to charge that invoice. So really, I think our biggest finding is that there was lack of documentation that should have been there, that traditionally is there to support invoices and task authorizations or contracts.
Is it uncommon for TA comes into place, they have a determination at which they wanted to do a contract, they have skills and so forth that they've identified, but suddenly things are moving around, and certainly that was the case here. Is it uncommon for people then to be moved into other contracts and other opportunities? Because I believe the Ombudsman made reference to this quite a bit.
So I would say that there are many reasons why sometimes the resources you listed in a task authorization may not be available, or may be asked to work on different projects. But there are mechanisms in the government to make sure that it's clear that if it's a contract or a task authorization, what work you expect to happen, so that when the invoice comes in, you can validate that the government received the services that they contracted out and paid at the right rate. A lot of that information here was missing. So while you might switch a resource or ask them to do something else, it should be documented. Those are just basic expectations to demonstrate due diligence and prudent use of public funds.
In your report and in your discussion with CBSA, there's some discrepancy in terms of the overall cost of ArriveCAN, because you can't reconcile what has taken place here. There's about 16 million or so that they've identified as being other applications. Did you see value for money in those contracts?
So the agency raised concerns around about $12 million that was included in the $59 million. Because they felt at times of a general nature, or it wasn't clear that it related to ArriveCAN. And I think that's exactly our main finding, is that their records should be better to demonstrate that. When we looked more specifically at that $12 million, we felt that about half of it was clearly linked to the ArriveCAN application, and in fact half of it had been provided to another parliamentary committee previously as expenses linked to ArriveCAN. This just speaks to why it's important to document as you go and make sure that the work is clear, and that the evidence that you have to support that work took place is fulsome. Then there are no questions when we come in and look to audit or raise questions around value for money.
And thank you very much. Suivant, c'est la députée Vignola.
Next, Ms. Vignola, 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Hogan, for being here, Mr. Hayes and Mr. Hanouch. Isn't it usual that a business knows the requirements? In this case, CBSA would include in the definitive version of the procurement proposal. Is it customary practice that the contractor tells an agency what to do? No. Our observation is that GC Strategies was involved in setting the requirements of a competitive contract. And this, in my opinion, should not have happened. The Canadian Border Services Agency gave a competitive edge to a potential supplier, and it is only GC Strategies that actually met the requirements. The requirements were very restrictive and limited competition, in my opinion. So in regard to those very restrictive requirements, and notably in terms of the experience of the human resources, if my memory serves me well, a requirement of 10 years of experience. And then we see later in the report that there were tasks that required 10 years of experience, but which were actually not carried out by individuals that had that 10 years of experience. So what kind of problems can this give rise to in terms of the quality of the work and requirements and so forth? I would expect that requirements when it comes to the skills of the individuals who are going to work on a contract be very clear and be spelled out in the contract or in the task authorization or job description. And we noted that in many cases these requirements were not clear in the contract, nor was there any documentation required to explain why the agency resorted to individuals with 10 years experience or more. So it's normally to get the best value for services rendered for the price paid. All of the resources need 10 years experience or more, but then we saw situations where it was not the case. So I would have expected that the government question why those resources did the work and why the price was so high. So if I've understood correctly, for a contractor who does only the hiring of resources, because that's all that GC Strategies did, says, okay, my resources are going to cost $15,000 a day, and I have a 30% commission, then it would be, advantageous to get higher skilled resources. I mean, if they're suggesting higher skilled resources, the total amount they are going to get is going to be a bigger amount. In this case, it was CBSA that asked that resources have 10 years or more experience. We wonder why. We would have expected a mix of experience to be able to implement such an application. But there's no documentation to explain the decision made by the agency to require that resource have 10 years experience or more. But would they asked that at the suggestion of another business? Well, the documentation and record keeping is so slim that we're lacking information about interaction and discussions between the agency and the supplier we would have expected to see. I find it troubling. 1.64. There are many very troubling paragraphs, but in 164, you mentioned that there is no evidence of any of the resources qualifications found. If I've understood correctly, that for non-competitive contracts, there's no demonstration needed concerning the resources and their skills. But right after, you say there is no evidence about the requirements in competitive procurement. So you require something, but you don't know if the resources have met the requirements or skilled above the requirements. We don't have requirements in a contract to say what kind of skill levels required. There's no evaluation of the individuals who are being proposed as being the resources in the contract. So we didn't have that assessment in the procurement process. In those that were competitive, we saw the requirement of 10 years experience or more, but without an explanation of the why. So that comes to the fact that decisions made are important decisions when a contract is awarded, and they were not documented in the agency's files. So it was done, but we don't quite know why it's done, nor how it's done. Well, it's not required, it's not explained, and then there's no assessment if there's no requirement in the contract. These are the most basic processes when you have a procurement process, and we did not see them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I, too, want to thank Ms. Hogan, the Auditor General of Canada, for your work in tabling this report. I think it's important to make a mention that your report and the work that your office does is incredibly valuable to this institution and to ensuring that we have an opportunity to rebuild public trust, because your facts here outline, I think, a very disturbing trend and reality that I think Canada will continue to be vulnerable to should we continue on this path. And absent of the recommendations you've made in here, which I completely agree with, I've noticed that the CBSA has also agreed with all of them. But at the end of my remarks, I hope to find ways to go further in that advice to see what systematic changes may be required beyond some of the CBSA changes that look at, for example, our public service and the work that they could do. Because you make mention about the deficits in the work that these contractors did that resulted in immense costs to Canadians when we don't deal particularly with the strength of our own public service. And so what I see here is an incredibly difficult and incredibly challenging truth which is facing Canadians, one that is dealing with the terrible consequences of a bloated shadow public service, the consequences that result in invoices that are immense in terms of the duties that they're being asked to do in relation to what they're invoicing for are completely different. And you make mention about that in regards to the 10-year requirement for some projects, and the reality that much of the work didn't require 10 years of service or expertise in order to conduct some of the work that was being invoiced to the government, which created a larger and ever expanding issue of cost. And so I want to turn to the graph outlined on page 7 Exhibit 1.2, the Canada Border Service Agency continued to rely heavily on external resources to develop ArriveCAN from April 2020 to March 2023. In there, it makes important note of the cost differential between the average per diem daily cost for equivalent IT work. It makes mention that over the period, you estimated the cost for the ArriveCAN for external resources was $1,090, whereas the average daily cost for equivalent IT positions in the Government of Canada was $675. In your opinion, would it have reduced the costs to Canadians should the public service had the opportunity to do some of this work? Not all, perhaps, but I do recognize the need at times for contracts. But in this particular instance, do you think that value for money was lost because of neglect to the work that the public service could have done?
So I think here we were trying to highlight, and I want to be clear that it's not a very linear thing. It wasn't, use an external resource or use an internal one, but it was just demonstrating how continued reliance on external resources can start to hinder the value that taxpayers receive for money spent. It was reasonable, in our view, at the start of the pandemic to seek resources or help outside of the public service. What I would have expected, however, was as time went on that dependency would have reduced and that there would have been a transition to internal resources, either to operate the application or a transfer of knowledge. And your question started off with, what could we do going forward as a public service to improve things? And I think having that worked into some of the contracts would be a great place to start, where you recognize that the public service might need to upskill or might not have certain skills that are needed or aren't needed every day. And how do you transition some of that knowledge from the private sector to the public service so that going forward you can have options that are available that might be less costly and then result in better value for money?
Thank you for that, Ms. Hogan. In terms of, I think there's two aspects that I want to focus on in my rounds to continue. One is on the actual existence of the shadow public service, this network of contractors that seem to have preferential access to the CBSA in this instance. You have noted in your report that there was many instances that there were individuals who received invitations or gifts to events that would have otherwise enabled contact with these contractors. That lack of evidence that is documented suggests that they were influenced by these gifts or these events. Would you say that that's an immense concern that you also have?
I think it was clear here that there was existing relationships between the public service and some of the vendors, and that the invitations that were received to attend events are likely more common in the private sector than they are in the public sector, but they exist. And that's why there's a code of conduct. And the agency's code of conduct required that individuals notify their supervisor that they received these invitations. And that's done in order to eliminate real or perceived conflicts of interest and to remove any bias that may have existed in contracting. We saw no evidence that individuals who had been invited had followed the code of conduct and reported to their supervisors. Perhaps it happened, but there is nothing documented. And so it really raises the risk that there is a conflict of interest or bias in some of the procurement decisions that were done.
I think I probably have to...
I tell you what, you give me this time, I'll give it back to you if you're a little
Deal.
longer next time. Thank you. Turning to our next round, Mr. Genuis, I understand you're splitting your 5-minute slot. The floor is yours.
Madam Auditor General, thank you. I am going to go quickly. Your report found that the average daily pay rate for each contractor and consultant who worked on ArriveScan was $1,100 per day. That seems incredible to me. How do these costs compare to what would normally be paid for people working on this kind of project?
So that's a difficult question to answer when we really just focused in on the resources that we're working on ArriveCAN, and that's where the average comes from. As I answered to a previous question, I would have expected that the dependency on those external resources would have reduced over time, but I also would have expected that the requirement to always ask for resources with 10 years of experience or more would have been better documented or justified. A mix is likely a better combination of lesser experience and 10 years or more, and that would have resulted in better value for money for taxpayers.
Thank you. And your report identifies that the $1,100 per day is substantially more than people working inside the public service would receive. Your report reveals shocking details about cozy relationships between the Trudeau government and the contractors at GC Strategies who got the ArriveCan contract. This company was actually involved in the development of the rules and requirements for making proposals. This seems to me akin to having the coach of one of the teams making the rules and directing the referee, an effective rigging of the process. Now, Liberals didn't want this audit to happen at all, which is why they voted against it in the House of Commons. You found that rules were broken when contracting vendors offered gifts, hospitality, and invitations that were not properly reported. So I'd like to ask, how many public servants receive these kinds of gifts, hospitality, and invitations from contractors that were not properly documented or reported?
So I don't have exact figures at my hands, and I probably don't have an exhaustive list, but we did see that it was more than one contractor who invited individuals in the branch that developed ArriveCan, but we saw no documentation that any of those invitations that we saw through emails had been reported to supervisors, and that's what's concerning, is that would have helped the supervisor put in place measures to make sure that there wasn't apparent or real conflicts of interest.
So roughly how many individuals, and also could you provide the committee with a list of names of those who offered and those who received these kinds of invitations?
So we can go back through our file and look at what we have to provide you, but it would be really just linked to ArriveCan, and the department might be able to, or the agency might be able to provide you a more comprehensive list if you want to ask them when they're here.
Thank you. If I understood right, though, you are able to go through and provide what you have to the committee on that?
Will have, but it isn't in any way comprehensive. We'll see what we can provide you.
And just a final comment, I think the reason this is important is because it's clear from what we're hearing from the government that they are trying to use an internal investigation to pin this whole affair on one or two individuals. But the investigator who is supposed to be undertaking their internal investigation is actually subject to the existing chain of command. So that process is just as rigged, just as susceptible to influence as the original bid was. And with that, I'll end my time.
Thank you. Ms. Kuzi, you have the floor now for 2 minutes.
So we've established that this goes far beyond the existing criminal investigation, that there were existing relationships that you indicated, Auditor General, that could have provided bias or leaning towards serious contractors. My colleagues have established that there was no value for money for Canadians here. An app that was supposed to cost $80,000 ending up costing $60 million. We see $60 million spent, $12.2 million, potentially unrelated even to this application, 18% of invoices by contractors who did not provide supporting documentation, and even work being completed without security clearances. Regarding the contracting, when we look at all this, when we look at all of these discrepancies, this incompetence, possible malfeasance, who is fundamentally responsible for the contracting, Auditor General? Who has the final say on overseeing contracting for the ArriveCan app?
So I would back it up to say fundamentally that the deputy head, in this case the president of Canada Border Services Agency, is responsible for all decisions that are made within the department. That being said, there are delegations of authority that go to other layers of the public service. And I draw a difference between individuals who do the work and then individuals who oversee and make decisions. And those individuals are usually in management, director, DG, assistant deputy minister level. And they set the tone for making sure that policies and basic requirements are followed. And we just found a glaring disregard for that here. We could not find documented evidence as to who made the ultimate decision to choose a vendor or why that vendor was chosen, but we did see a contract requisition that was signed by an executive director in the department. In my view, a public servant who exercises their delegation of authority, signing on something, comes with a responsibility and accountability for that decision being made. And if they feel that they've been pressured or didn't want to make the decision, that they should have informed their supervisor or they should have documented, there are recourses that public servants can take if they feel that they shouldn't be exercising the delegation of authority that's granted to them.
And thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
That is your time. Ms. Killey, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Auditor General, for this for the important work that you've done. Now, you've suggested that the value for money was not achieved. Did you also investigate the cost of using paper processing versus the cost of using ArriveCAN over time? I know that on the CBSA website, it indicates that paper processing would have been almost $95 million versus the cost of the ArriveCAN app. Looking for your thoughts on that.
So we did conclude that the best value for money was not achieved here. There was some value, and I'll point back to our report in 2021. We issued 2 reports looking at border measures. The second actually noted that because of ArriveCAN, the government was able to improve the quality of information collected from travelers, and they were able to follow up with travelers in a more timely way. Now, there were still many travelers that weren't followed up, but the app sped up the process, the paper process that was originally there. I would add that there is also an enduring value to this application, as now CBSA has sort of springboarded off what was done here to automate the border, something they had been working on before the pandemic, and they use this as a sort of a springboard to go there. So there is some sort of enduring value left post the use during the pandemic. We did look at what it might cost for a piece of paper versus automation, and it really isn't a linear calculation. I think we would have probably landed somewhere around $3 or so for a piece of paper. But again, I think it's more about the quality of the information and the timing, right? The paper was making its way to the Public Health Agency 28 days after an individual had crossed the border. Really hard to follow up on a 14-day quarantine. So, the value, I don't think should be quantified, but should be in the fact that there was a more timely follow-up with travelers during the height of the pandemic.
In your report, when you identify that this is the overlooking of it is based on efficiency, about the value and effectiveness of the app itself, would you say that between the paper-based and the automotive, that there was value there?
Well, as I said, there was some value. I would tell you that the government was effective at delivering on this app. It was done very quickly, quicker than you would see most things. Was it efficient and provide good value for money? That's where I would tell you no. The government has paid too much for this app. The public service should do better going forward on projects like this.
Now, you had also I outlined that you were very concerned that one of your main concerns was about the poor record-keeping practices. Now, are you concerned that there is widespread corruption that is ongoing?
I think the confusion that we saw with the record keeping, and I would tell you that it's probably some of the worst record keeping I have seen in a long time, is because there was no documentation outside of record keeping. When an individual receives an invoice and it's not clear what app a worker was working on or what IT project a worker was working on, it's very difficult to allocate it in your records to the best place. And we actually saw journal entries where items were being moved around, and we needed to trace back through many steps in order to get to supporting documentation. At times, it was very clear that it was linked to ArriveCAN. Other times, it required judgment to know whether or not it was of such a general nature that it should be associated with the ArriveCAN or not. So it is about, making sure that the public servants have the information they need to make the right decisions. And in this case, there was a disregard for some of those really basic elements that we traditionally see.
Now, you are in communication with the CBSA president. Are you satisfied by the steps that have been taken so far to fix some of these practices that you've outlined?
So we haven't really looked at the steps that the agency has taken since. I do look at the fact that they're receiving many recommendations. There's recommendations from my report, recommendations from the ombuds. I would tell you that they're aligned and complementary, and the agency has a lot of work ahead of them to ensure that what I would think are some of the most basic elements around project, contract management, and record keeping need to be fixed.
And do you think that people working from home or working remotely had an impact on poor record keeping as well, or do you think that this is just an oversight on the part of the public service?
Well, I believe that the public service was trying to act quickly in an emergency. And I would tell you that while they were given flexibility from Treasury Board Secretariat to reduce some of the normal processes and red tape, it also came with a reminder that exercising due diligence and demonstrating prudent use of public funds should be done. And I think here that, an emergency was not an excuse to throw out the window the basic rules that the public service normally follows. And I would expect better from the public service, and I have seen the public service do better.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est la députée.
Next, Ms. Vignola, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Thank you very much, Ms. Hogan. Under 167, we see timesheets that were given, and you see authorizations and signatures, but there's no detail as to the work done. So were these timesheets all from the same business, or was this a generalized problem? And was it always the same persons providing the authorizations? No, it was not always the same business, nor was it always the same individuals approving the timesheets. In some cases, we saw it very well done, and in other cases, a lack of essential information that should have been included. It is not a best practice to approve timesheets, and then after the timesheets are provided as justification for invoicing. It should have been the contractor who approved the timesheets, then a public servant. We also have cases where task authorizations, you have deliverables that are unclear. You don't know what the purpose was, what tasks were to be carried out. And yet, this is provided to GC. Now, what is this? Just a big open door to abuse? In my opinion, it is not flexibility. Flexibility might skip a couple steps, but it should not serve to remove essential information to manage a contract or to manage a project or to be truly accountable. If it's non-respect of essential elements that we should have seen in the procurement process and project management process, there are also contracts that were modified and signed off by CBSA and PSPC, but they did not contain any modifications in the tasks. But in terms of deadlines and cost, there were changes made. Is that something you see often in your analyses? Well, that's another of our observations in support of our conclusion that the value received for funds spent should have been better. Extensions are reasonable. It's reasonable to see extensions granted. Normally, that should not be for changing deadlines or changing the cost of a project. If there are increases, there is because there's a new deliverable added. But oftentimes we did not see that it was due to an increase in tasks, but rather to push back deadlines. And that's what increased the cost. And that's why the value received was not the best. Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Deschalets.
2 seconds, just so you know, it's not a lot more, but I'm mindful to give you the time you owed. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do now want to turn to the findings under 1.56, where you found that GC Strategies was involved in the development of requirements that the Canada Border Service Agency ultimately included in a request for proposal. A deeply troubling fact that I think Canadians, we need to reflect on. The ability of private actors to directly influence the competition of a bid that they are participating in. Massive, massive red flag in my perspective, because not only is it an abuse of the rules and regulations that exist for competitive bids, but it masks the true intent of the public service in some ways, which just prior, to use this as an example, there was 3 non-competitive contracts held by GC Strategies prior to May of 2022. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then to follow that, we witnessed CBSA then undergo a competitive process, replacing those 3 non-competitive contracts by then selecting the very same contractor that was the recipient of the contract in the non-competitive process. Is that true?
Yes, I think in this case, the contractor was involved in setting some of the requirements, and that should not happen. That really does limit competition. We found that the requirements that were used were so restrictive that the only vendor that responded to the request for proposal was GC Strategies. And so the Canada Border Services Agency gave them an advantage that other bidders just did not have.
And what evidence did you find in your review of this work that demonstrated that connection between the influences that CBSA would have had on the public, the GC Strategies had on CBSA? And what information? Was it emails? Was it text messages? Was it documents? Was it letters that you found evidence to suggest that there was a direct influence here?
So in this case, it was correspondence, emails between the vendor and individuals who were setting out the request for proposal. It was exact word for word requirements that were then used in the process. I would also point you to the Procurement Ombuds report, who outlined many other requirements. We just gave you a sample of some. But these were all very restrictive and likely limited competition, and in the end did, as the only vendor who responded was GC Strategies.
Wow.
You have a brief question, Mr. Desjardins, but it will need to be brief.
Sure. In terms of those documents, would it be possible for some of that correspondence related to the example you outlined here to be shared with this committee in advance of our further studies?
We can go back through. I think it might already be shared with other parliamentary committees. We can go back through our file and see if we can locate that, although we will be here tomorrow, so I'm not sure that we'll get it to you in advance, but we'll do our best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Ms. Block. You have the floor for 5 minutes. I understand you're sharing your time as well, but over to you.
Yes, that is correct, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, and thank you, Ms. Hogan, and to those joining you for being here today. You know, from the beginning of the Government Operations and Estimates Committee study into ArriveCAN, we have been told by Liberal members across the table that there was nothing to see here, and in fact, you could probably look at past committee studies or meetings to see that that is exactly what they said when we were undertaking or wanting to undertake this study. Little did they know, I guess, that you would find, and you have mentioned several times, that there was an alarming lack of documentation throughout the procurement process for this app, which I think is in keeping with what the Procurement Ombudsman stated in his report. So time and time again, we have heard that we should cut the public service or servants some slack because it was during the pandemic. And we even heard it today in regards to public servants working from home. Do you believe the glaring disregard for basic mismanagement and contracting practices, as well as the lack of documentation, can be sufficiently excused by the fact that it was during a pandemic?
No, I said it in my opening remarks. I do not believe that an emergency is an excuse for throwing the rules out of the window. These are some really basic elements that I would have expected to see. Documenting a decision on who is being selected and why they have the skills to carry out the work that you need done. Basic bookkeeping. factors that I would expect to see. Invoices well supported, making it clear what work should be charged to what project that's ongoing. I think that my advice to public servants would be to document as you go. And we saw other contracts throughout the pandemic, while had opportunities for improvement, were not as glaring as the lack of documentation that we see here.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's your signal, Mr. Brock. You've got the floor for about 2 minutes and 40 seconds.
Thank you, Chair. From $80,000 to approximately $60 million, and probably going to be continue more once we get some documentation. It's now abundantly clear to Canadians why the Liberal government under Justin Trudeau and its members did everything in their power to shut down your audit. They voted against your audit. They routinely shut down committees. Just last week, they shut down the committee that you and I were involved in when it was revealed that the RCMP were investigating. All of a sudden, they brought a motion to adjourn. And just last week, a release of the preliminary report by the CBSA investigator was too scary for some Liberal members, and they required a complete shutdown of witnesses to study the ArriveCan. So it's abundantly clear what they were trying to hide. This is a gross misuse of taxpayer funds. You indicated the public service should do better. This is an example of the worst record-keeping practices that you have seen in your tenure as the Auditor General. Do you believe there should be, in terms of moving forward, the CBSA has promised to make recommendations, to follow your recommendations for changes internally, but to the Canadians who are watching this, who have now realized that this government has abused and misused their taxpayer funds, what civil and criminal consequences should befall this government?
So matters of a criminal nature and decisions in that respect rest with law enforcement. In this case, the RCMP would be the experts to tell you what action, if any, is needed. That is not my place.
GC Strategies is under RCMP investigation, not for the ArriveCan app, but in relation to another application involving a software company out of Montreal, and the government as well, including the CBSA. That's the focus. The RCMP has never been focused on the ArriveCan app. During the course of your investigation led by Mr. Hanoush, shared to you, Ms. Hogan, and to Mr. Hayes, did you uncover elements of suspicion with respect to GC Strategies that warranted a potential referral to the RCMP?
So this is a bit of an unusual situation. Normally, when we're in auditing, the RCMP has not been referred matters. So in this case, they were referred in a matter around contracting. I am not aware if they've begun an investigation or where that investigation is going. So I didn't have to turn my mind to, do I need to decide if there are other things I should refer? I did have a conversation with the RCMP, and it was a very general one because our report was not yet made public. It was made public today only. I told them that if they would like to have access to our file, that they should send me an official request to do so, and we would be happy to provide them with any of the evidence that we have.
And thank you very much. I'm afraid that is the time. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
It's been quite the morning. Thank you for coming. So my question is, why was the CBSA own procurement directorate not involved in the contracting process?
That's an excellent question. I'd encourage you to ask Canada Border Services Agency. Many departments have their own procurement arm that is there to help ensure that policies are followed and best practices are there. Oftentimes they might work with Public Service and Procurement Canada to ensure that there's good competition and the best value for money is achieved. But what we found here in this case was that individuals were directly working with Public Service and Procurement Canada, and that they weren't always involving their own procurement directorate. And we made a recommendation around that being a best practice that really should be used. They're there because they are experts in contracting and can help ensure that a contracting file is well supported of all the decisions that should be in there are well documented.
In terms of user testing, 12 out of 25 did not complete user testing, and 10 out of 13 had user methodology, but the testing results were incomplete. Why did this happen?
So this is really a best practice we would have expected to see when there is an IT project. So in this case, there was 177 releases to the application. We focused in on the 25. So the numbers that you're referring to are really what we focused in on, which was their 25 major releases, which meant that there was a significant change happening to the ArriveCan application. You would normally expect to see a plan for good user testing to ensure that the application's operating as intended, and that you would document the results of those testings and any corrective measures if needed. When we looked at those 25, we found that 12 of them actually had nothing documented. It doesn't mean that testing didn't happen, but there was no proof that testing had occurred. What the risk is there is that you release an app that isn't functioning as intended, and in fact, that's what Canada saw at some point when 10,000 travelers were incorrectly told that they needed to quarantine. And so we would expect that the department would have done all this testing and documented it well before releasing a change to the application.
How were procurement contracts decided to be tendered on a competitive or a non-competitive basis?
So that decision usually rests with the department making the decision. There are many reasons why you could choose a non-competitive contract. They're allowed in the procurement policies and directives. But when that happens, you would expect that you would clearly have documented your interactions with the vendor, and that you would have also documented clearly why you chose them. Typically, to go non-competitive, there needs to be a really good, valid reason. And in this case, there was very little documentation as to why GC Strategies was selected and how they could fulfill the requirements of the contract.
Okay. How much time?
About 90 seconds.
Okay. So in terms of, was there a deep lack of documentation? I guess, well, there is obviously not enough documentation in bookkeeping practice, and other places, other departments, there were. So what do you think made the difference in these bookkeeping practices?
So it's a question, again, I think you should probably ask the department, but when we spoke to many people, what we heard is that they were in the pandemic. It was a never before seen situation. The public service was asked to act quickly to support Canadians. But the basic elements that we would have expected to see just aren't there. It's a head scratcher for me as to why they're not there. I've definitely seen the public service do better. It isn't just around contracting, but it was around project management, no oversight and no budget. It was around user testing on the applications. There was so many key elements that I would have expected to see documented that just aren't there. And when you don't have the records, many of the questions you're asking just can't be answered.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, and that is the time. Auditor, I want to thank you and your team for coming in today. Look, I've said this before in private, but I do appreciate you coming before this parliamentary committee, arranging your office to be here for the lockup this morning for parliamentarians. That is invaluable to us, and then coming to committee with your opening statements and to hear directly from lawmakers. I know we're going to see you again tomorrow, you and your team, along with departmental officials. We look forward to that. And with the committee's approval, I will suspend or adjourn this meeting. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you again.